A lot of people in the IT sector shy away from open source software, and so I wanted to present arguments both for and against its use, because the reality is that open source software is good for some things and bad for others, and I don't think the fact that people are scared of using open source software helps anyone. This isn't a video explaining the differences between different open source licenses. It's about the kinds of considerations you should give to both open and closed source software in your company. It's my experience that people look down on open source software for several reasons. In no particular order, these reasons include a lack of understanding of what open source software is, and why it's open source, and why it's sometimes free. Brand loyalty, even on a subconscious level. A desire for power, even if that desire is only subconscious as well. Doubt about someone's own decision-making abilities and the developers around them. But before we go too far ahead of ourselves, what is open source software? Open source software is just any piece of software whose source code is publicly available. This doesn't mean that the software is free or that anyone else is permitted to make any changes to it, just that if someone were so inclined, they could go and read the source code to find out exactly what the software does and how it does it. In a business environment, this means that you can check that the program doesn't include any viruses or anything that you don't particularly want, or anything that might be considered dangerous. When most people hear the words open source, they immediately go straight to the assumption that the software is free. But that's not the case. Plenty of closed source software is free, and there are plenty of examples of paid for open source software too. The owners of open source projects often sell support to their product as an add-on. Oracle sells support for MySQL databases, for example. One of the most common assumptions I hear people mentioning when they're talking about open source software is that the software will be insecure or of poor quality. After all, if the software was any good, surely the creator would want to make money from it. If this is what you think, you may be interested to learn that virtually all encryption software used to secure your files is at least partially open source. Encryption software doesn't rely on keeping the formulas it uses to protect your files actually secret, because when someone did find out the formula later, everything encrypted with that formula would be insecure. Software can be made open source for many reasons. If the project is just a hobby project, the author may want to allow other people to help with it, without having to worry about transferring files in private. If the project is of such magnitude that it will create a standard for how a particular task should be done in the future, the core elements will often be open source, with different vendors building the individual strain of the software around those open source elements, which is exactly what encryption software does. On the other hand, some people will make their software open source because they are lazy and unfortunately they want others to work for them, but because they are the main author, they will be able to take the credit for the software later on. It's also interesting to note that people often refer to products as being completely open source or completely closed source, as though there are only those two options. The reality is that there's actually much more of a spectrum than that. As I said at the start of this, I don't want to discuss the individual licenses, but at the same time you should be aware of the fact that there are these different licenses, and each license does allow you to do different things with each end product. With regards to why software can be free, there are many reasons, but the most common one is the fact that these projects are often developed by people in their spare time, and they simply don't have the time or the desire to support any customers. It's also inevitable that people will start a project with full intentions of creating a product that they can charge for, but then realise the difficulty of the task at hand, not make any progress, and eventually just release the code as open source so that other people can look at the code later on. Investigating and making the distinction around why a piece of software may be open source can be a time-consuming and often fruitless task, while investigating a publicly traded corporation like Microsoft, for example, would be much easier. But doing so could allow you to potentially save your company significant amounts of money if you make the right decision. If you were hiring someone for a position at your office and you had two applicants who looked identical on paper, and they seemed identical in the interview and everything else, but you happen to know one of the candidates from somewhere else that you worked in the past, you're statistically more likely to hire the person that you already know. It doesn't matter that the other candidate can do the job to the exact same standard, or even if they can do it to a slightly higher standard. Human beings have a natural instinct to be more positive towards people we know when compared to our attitude towards people we don't know. The exact same attitude rolls over into software acquisition too. You may have used products developed by a specific company before, and you will most likely have some level of brand loyalty because of that fact. This is why software companies like Microsoft offer huge discounts to students for their products. It's not because they want the students to use the best software or because of some altruistic purpose. It's to build that familiarity and brand loyalty from as early as possible. They know that when those students move into the professional work world, they will want to use the same software that they're already familiar with. Microsoft Visio and Microsoft Project are two great examples of this. These programs are available on Amazon for several £100 each, but the exact same products are available for students for about a sixth of the cost. A total of £873 for both programs for non-students, compared to £145 for both programs for students. That's not a small incentive. It seems fairly clear that Microsoft is effectively buying brand loyalty there. That's not to say that you should necessarily find open source alternatives to all Microsoft's products either. Your company may well be making better use of its human resources by giving them the software that they're familiar with than learning an open source alternative and paying for training for that to happen. This is especially true if the software is used in frontline roles with many users. It's probably less true if the software is a back-end utility which is only ever used by 5 or 6 different people. But where the tipping point for your company lies in this regard will depend on your specific company. There's something satisfying about being a customer. You get exactly what you want, and if one supplier isn't able to provide it, you just go to a different supplier. But what if you aren't paying for your supplier though? And moving to a different supplier means that you have to start paying for things again. It's a very scary position to put yourself in, because you'll be giving up existing funding to move to a free solution, and so it stands to reason that you would have to find a line of funding if you need to move again in the future. This takes away a lot of the power you have as a customer, and even though it's unlikely going to impact the supplier of the free solution, the fact that it could make your role more difficult in the future is often enough to steer people away from free solutions. Now you might say that you don't care about power, but imagine having a developer of a piece of software who is genuinely indifferent about whether you use a piece of software or not, and trying to convince them to add a new feature just for you. Imagine how infuriating this could be. This is a very real possibility when dealing with open source free software, and it's why one of the biggest questions you need to ask when considering open source software is why the software is open source in the first place. If you're able to contact the developer asking them to make a change for you, they may be happy to accommodate you. But what if they charge you for this? Your free solution has now cost you money. All of a sudden your business case that using this piece of software will save your company money is no longer true. Not only does your company not have any power over the developer, you have lost power over the solution, and your company may even lose confidence in your decision-making ability. Now surely you know what you're getting with closed source paid services, and that's not true with open source or free equivalents, right? Not quite. If someone's trying to make money from a product, they'll probably put more effort into marketing it and outlining what they consider to be the key functions of the product. But clearer marketing isn't going to tell you whether the company is at risk of bankruptcy or insolvency, in which case they could easily disappear, or even whether there is any malicious code in the product. It doesn't tell you why they created the software in the first place, or how much time they've spent working on the product, or what sort of quality the product has been developed to. These are all the sorts of questions that should be considered as part of the acquisition process for any software, open or closed source, but all too frequently they are left unanswered. Let's just break those points down real quickly. If the company goes bankrupt, they're not going to be able to support their products. This is the equivalent of an open source developer deciding to no longer support their product. There will always be this inherent risk. You can limit the risk, however, by either having a conversation with the developer and getting to know them before incorporating the product into your platform, or with a paid product, you can research the company to see how much profit and loss they are reporting for tax purposes. When was the last time you did that for any piece of software that you purchased which your company now relies on? What if they hide malicious code in the software? Or what if you are worried about the quality of the software? If it's open source, and if you don't program yourself, you will likely be able to call upon the services of a programmer unconnected to the original project and ask them to review the code to confirm its authenticity and its quality. For closed source software, the only options you have are to scan it for viruses, and assuming it passes your virus scan, try it out to see if you notice anything out of the ordinary. Just because the creator of the software says it's not malicious doesn't mean anything. There's no real definitive way to tell whether the quality of a product is good or bad, but if you ask an experienced programmer to review the product for you, they will likely be able to tell you if they see anything that they consider to be a cause for concern. Things they might spot might only be small things, but there will be these small smoke signals if the product is poor. Things like misalignment of text, spelling mistakes, inconsistencies with the way the program operates. An experienced programmer wouldn't allow these things to slip through into a final release version of a product, so if they do, you know that something probably isn't right. If you want to find out how long someone has worked on a piece of software and why they created the product in the first place, you can send an email to the creator of open source projects, and they will likely respond. There's no real reason for them to give false information. They aren't making money from a product, so that information isn't valuable to them. If you emailed the creator of a closed source product, however, asking how much time they have spent on the product or why they created the product in the first place, you're likely not going to get a real answer, because the fact that they make money from the product means that that information that you're asking for is sensitive company information which could be used by any competition to take sales from them. If there's only one point that I would encourage you to take away from this, it's that you must ask different questions when you're considering open source solutions compared to the questions you would probably ask when you're considering a closed source alternative. You need to build a relationship with the developer in a way that you wouldn't necessarily need to build one with a paid for product. But the reality is that these are all questions that you should be considering in all cases anyway. You should be building relationships with your suppliers, whether the software is closed source or open source or anything else.